Darkcast Network, indie pods with a dark side. Hello and welcome back to Fuck That. Two quick things before I jump into this week's episode. I wanted to give a shout out to Tanya and Lindsay. They are two awesome people that listen to the podcast that sent me some amazing messages and made my fucking day. So thank you both for that. Love you so much, but not in a creepy way. Second thing is, if you haven't checked out the Patreon yet, definitely check it out. I'm working on growing that, so for now, there's ad-free episodes. But in addition to that, once I have more people sign up, I will start putting out, which I already have set up, extra content that will not air on my channel regularly. And then on top of that, you get swag when you sign up, case suggestions, live chats within the group, and a bunch of other stuff as well. It's patreon.com/fthatpod. I'm really excited for this week's episode because thankfully, nobody dies, so let's jump right in. On a warm summer's day on August 23rd of 1973, the quiet calm of Stockholm, Sweden's upscale Norrmalmstorg Square was shattered by a very distinctive sound, the crackling of gunfire. Okay, really quick before I continue, I have a lot of listeners in Sweden, and I want you all to know that I looked up the pronunciation for any name that I didn't think I could pronounce in this case, and I wrote how it sounded phonetically next to the name. I'm going to try really hard, but just know that I might butcher it, but I did research the way it sounds. So I apologize in advance if I butcher anything. Please forgive me. Okay, so an escaped convict had entered Sweden's Kreditbanken, which, by the way, fantastic word. Next time I walk into my bank, which is probably never because everything's online, I'm going to try to sprinkle that into conversation and see how they react. Probably not well. Sweden's Kreditbanken was a bustling bank in the heart of the city, and the convict's actions over the next 6 days would etch his name into criminal folklore, birthing a new term in psych. I don't know why I said birthing. Why did I use that word? We're going to roll with it. Birthing a new term in psychological study. Stockholm Syndrome. I can't believe I used the term birthing. Please forgive me. I'm going off the rails and we're only 2 minutes in. Okay. This is the riveting story of the Norrmalmstorg Robbery. Jan-Erik Olsson, an escaped convict who happened to be on furlough from prison while serving a 3-year sentence at the time, and the central figure in this story, had already accumulated a history of multiple armed robberies and several violent acts, all by the age of 16. Concealing a loaded submachine gun beneath his jacket, Jan-Erik walked into the bank, intending to rob it. Jan-Erik prepared meticulously for this heist. With the submachine gun in his jacket, he gripped a suitcase in one of his hands, which held a really chilling array of supplies that he thought was critical to execute his plan. Inside the suitcase, there was an arsenal of resources, including spare ammunition for his submachine gun, 2 functional walkie-talkies, and a small transistor radio. Additionally, Jan-Erik carried another bag, which contained an extra pair of gloves, intended for an accomplice that was yet to arrive on scene. But this was a partner whose participation he confidently anticipated. Jan-Erik took absolutely no chances with his appearance, wearing what he considered to be an elaborate disguise that hopefully obscured his identity. He wore a pair of what seemed to be toy store glasses that sat atop of his nose kind of awkwardly. He had a thick brown wig, and he also, and this doesn't make any sense to me, but go off, he put rouge on his cheeks, and hopefully he used a good blush. I personally would have went in and added some highlighter, maybe a little bit of bronzer to give him a nice little contour, but the finishing touches came in the form of a dyed jet black mustache and eyebrows, which was a stark contrast to his natural hair, which was reddish brown. So apparently for Jan-Erik, it was Halloween in August, and he was now unrecognizable, allowing him to execute his plan with efficiency. Stepping into the Kreditbank's street floor level with swagger, Jan-Erik made his presence felt immediately. A multitude of customers and a mix of around 40 employees, ranging from tellers, mail deposit clerks, to secretaries and junior officials, quickly realized that this seemingly normal Thursday morning wasn't normal at all. Jan-Erik's abrupt intrusion disrupted the calm facade of the bank as he fired shots into the ceiling, yelling in a fake American accent, "The party has just begun." You know, sometimes I say that too when I'm walking into a room commanding attention, but I digress. Two things: I resent that, and it also makes me laugh because stereotypes exist for a reason, but I'm an American, so it's like, fuck. For the record, there are some of us that don't own machine guns and fire them into the ceiling, and I am one of them. Do with that information what you will. All right, let me get back to the case because I am off the rails again. Panic obviously consumed most of the people in the bank, and this prompted people to either drop to the floor in an instant, while others sought refuge in a small repository. But then there were a few that were motivated by fear and, quite frankly, probably bravery, rushed and made a beeline towards the exits. As if the bank didn't have enough going on already, the bank's marble interior quickly echoed with the strange and unfamiliar sounds of rock music. The source was obviously Jan-Erik's radio. This guy obviously came prepared and ready to bring the chaos, so he strategically placed this radio on the teller's counter to create even more confusion and chaos in an already very tense and unfamiliar event in Sweden. This doesn't happen in Sweden. Granted, this was in the 70s, but guess what? Shit like this doesn't typically happen in Sweden. I'm not saying there are never any crimes there, but if we're going to compare it to what happens in the United States, this is very much foreign territory. And for that, I am jealous, but also happy for them. Amidst all of the chaos that he created, Jan-Erik's gaze fixated on Kristen Enmark, a 23-year-old stenographer who was attempting to deliver a freshly typed letter to the intended recipient within the loan department. As Jan-Erik met Kristen's gaze, he grabbed a rope from his suitcase, handed it to a nearby male bookkeeper, and prompted him to bind her by the ankles and the wrists. While lying bound on the floor, it wasn't long before Kristen soon noticed that her colleague Brigitte Lundblad was also bound at her wrists and ankles. Jan-Erik then ordered the male bookkeeper to tie up a third employee, a 21-year-old cashier in the foreign exchange department named Elisabeth Oldgren. For the individuals stuck inside the bank that were still unclear of the reason for Jan-Erik's intrusion, it became abundantly clear as to what the man wanted when he began to shout, seemingly at random, "I want to talk to the police!" I should have been an actress, let me tell you. I probably just sounded more convincing in that one line than Jan-Erik himself. Unbeknownst to Jan-Erik and probably a majority of the individuals within the bank's silent alarm had already alerted authorities to the unfolding crisis, which prompted them to respond quickly. Both uniformed and plainclothes police descended upon Norrmalmstorg as the area was cordoned off. Sergeant Morgan Rylander, responding to the call, began to engage with Jan-Erik within the bank's walls. Jan-Erik asked Rylander if he was a cop, to which he replied with, "Nope, but I can bring you one." So Jan-Erik told him to go do it. So Rylander proceeded to go upstairs to the bank's executive offices, where he called and spoke with Superintendent Sven Thorander. While Sergeant Rylander was on the phone with headquarters, a detective in plain clothes, Inspector Ingemar Warpfelt, arrived on scene, startling Jan-Erik, which prompted him to then shoot the inspector, which struck him in the hand. When Sergeant Rylander returned to inform Jan-Erik that a superintendent was on the way, he was ordered to usher clients and employees out of the bank. But once he completed the task, Jan-Erik then ordered him to sit in a leather chair and sing. Eventually, Inspector Thorander arrived on scene, and negotiations began. It was obvious up until this point that Jan-Erik had a flair for the drama, to say the least, but he was also unpredictable, and This created an atmosphere of tension and fear. Unsurprisingly, Jan-Erik's demands were audacious to say the least. He sought for the release of his fellow convict and friend, Clark Olofsson, who was serving time for armed robbery and acting as an accessory to a fucking murder. The murder of a police officer in 1966. The limit does not exist truly with the audacity of this man, but he's not done. No. In addition to having his convict friend being brought to him where he is holding people hostage, he also wanted 3 million Swedish kroner, which is approximately $275K in the United States today, 2 guns, bulletproof vests, helmets, and a fucking Ford Mustang. This is an astonishing mix of criminal ambition, maybe cinematic flair, and really it just sounds like a scenario that is suited to a really weird Netflix movie that just didn't get enough budget. For those of you that don't know how this story unfolds and you're sitting wherever you are listening to this thinking, there's absolutely no way that those demands will be met in any capacity, let alone a prisoner being removed from prison and being delivered to a criminal who escaped prison during a furlough and is now holding people hostage during an armed robbery. Well, you're wrong, because that is exactly what happens that same Thursday afternoon, just shortly after 4 o'clock. Clark Olofsson was brought by the police from his cell in Norrköping to the bank. He did arrive at the bank in handcuffs through the back entrance, and he was taken to the second floor, which was where the police were using as their base during the ongoing siege. But they freed him from his handcuffs and led him down to the street level. As Clark scanned the room, he was puzzled at first, unsure of what was going on. But it didn't take long for Clark to recognize Jan-Erik from the time that they served together at the Kalmar Penitentiary. Wholesome times. Seems like they had a lot of fond memories together. Shortly after they are reunited, Jan-Erik motioned for Clark to step away from the hostages so that the 2 former inmates/criminal bros could have a private conversation. Jan-Erik's demeanor seemed to calm down with Clark's arrival. He stopped yelling at the hostages and he unbound them. While it remains unknown to this day whether Clark was involved in plotting Jan-Erik's scheme, what is known is that Jan-Erik had hidden in Stockholm with the assistance of a lady friend of Clark's from August 3rd to the 23rd. This was during his furlough, and the 23rd was the day of the robbery. Pretty coincidental. Now, inside the bank, once Clark and Jan-Erik were reunited, Clark began to help him in various ways throughout the siege, including relaying messages to the police, using explosives to open a cashier's drawer, which ended up yielding them around 90,000 kroner. Clark also destroyed some security camera footage, and he then began to scout for signs of police intrusion. Now, during his reconnaissance, Clark encountered Sven Safstrom. Sven was a blonde bachelor in his mid-20s who worked at the bank. Now, seeing Sven as a potential threat if they were to let him go, Clark insisted that they invite him to the group and hoped that he would join the group of hostages. Here's an invitation to join these 3 people that we had bound by the wrists and ankles and threw on the floor. Don't you want to join? This was obviously not appealing to Sven, and he ultimately became the 4th hostage. Now, the hostages spent their initial days with Jan-Erik, who kept them close to avoid being targeted by sharpshooters outside, allegedly. Jan-Erik's machine gun, which he, I don't know, I find this funny, but it just feels like a really bad dad joke with no punchline, that, or maybe it's just above my head, but he referred to it as his lawyer, and he kept his submachine gun always within reach. Seriously, I've been thinking about this for days, though. Does he call it his lawyer because he doesn't need a lawyer, because he'll just annihilate people with a submachine gun? Like, what does he mean by that? I need to know. Jan-Erik, if you're out there, because you didn't clarify it in your book, can you please tell me why your submachine gun is called your lawyer? I can't spend another sleepless night trying to understand the punchline of this joke. All right, circling back to the fucking submachine gun, the lawyer. It was always within reach, and Jan-Erik demonstrated his willingness to use his lawyer by firing it at what he said were sharpshooters in a nearby park, and he did this because he wanted to show how fucking unpredictable he was, as if he has not shown everybody how deranged he is already. As far as the living quarters for the hostages, Jan-Erik and Clark decided that the bank's safe deposit vault on the ground floor was ideal. Jan-Erik saw it as a secure place away from the sharpshooters with good sleeping conditions. I mean, define good in this situation, but they also had amenities like toilets and a snack machine. The vault contained deposit boxes, so this created a very cramped and oppressive atmosphere. Inside the vault, however, in spite of all of this chaos, a very strange camaraderie began to take shape when Elizabeth, one of the hostages, expressed that she was claustrophobic, and this was being exacerbated by being kept in the confines of a vault. Out of the kindness of his heart, Jan-Erik decided to let her out of the vault while tethered to a rope to walk within the bank's confines. Later, Kristen and Brigitte were also allowed short trips for privacy or relief. And in another seemingly kind act, and I'm using this loosely, air quotations, kind, Jan-Erik draped his jacket over a shivering Kristen. There was communication with the police as well as the outside world, and this mainly took place through the telephone that was located inside of the bank's vault. Jan-Erik demanded for rumpled old money, which led the police to quickly try to gather the required funds. This is a really sporadic request. I couldn't really find an explanation why. I don't think there's a reason for it other than to cause chaos. All of these events transpired, by the way, on day one. We are at Thursday night. Jan-Erik arrived there right when the bank opened Thursday morning. But before the day was over, Jan-Erik decided that he was going to contact Prime Minister Palm, threatening the hostages' lives if his escape plan wasn't granted. Now, initially, his demands just required that they deliver Clark, I think 2 guns, a bulletproof vest, a Ford Mustang, and then Swedish kroner, which they were already meeting. However, as the day progressed and Jan-Erik realized that he was deeper into this and likely wouldn't get out unscathed and without getting apprehended, he decided that he wanted to up the ante and require that the hostages be released along with them and that they would all be allowed to escape together. During the call, Jan-Erik threatened to end the hostages' lives if his escape plan wasn't granted, and then the call ended abruptly when Jan-Erik grabbed Elizabeth by the throat. The hostages then settled in for the night, with Kristen, Elizabeth, Clark, and Sven finding their comfy sleeping spots somewhere within the cramped vault. The following morning, Friday, August 24th, Jan-Erik fired warning shots at a police officer and a civilian that tried to communicate with him. The officer pleaded with Jan-Erik, calling him Kai Hansen, who was a convict that had escaped and was known for committing bank robberies. The fact that police mistook the identification of Jan-Erik as another criminal made him really upset, and it led to a dramatic episode that reinforced his suspicion of police tactics. Later that day, newspapers, food, beer, and bedding were delivered to the bank, and Commissioner Lindroth inspected the hostage conditions. The hostages, by now, were beginning to display a very unexpected camaraderie with Clark and Jan-Erik, while their attitude towards the commissioner during his walkthrough was hostile and withdrawn. The commissioner later described this to the press in an interview shortly after his inspection. The press and the unrelenting media coverage surrounding this case is a common theme within the story. As the hours trickled by, the media frenzy intensified, and television screens across Sweden broadcasted the unfolding drama, and the public's imagination ran wild. The public began to make suggestions on how to resolve the standoff, and this meant that people were flooding the police headquarters with several ideas that ranged from bizarre, like sending a swarm of angry bees in. This was a legitimate suggestion, by the way. How fucking unhinged. To more hopeful, like a concert by a Salvation Army band that played religious tunes. This was the first criminal event in Sweden to be covered by live television. As the situation continued, interviews with the hostages began to raise confusion and speculation among the public about their behavior and their relationship with Jan-Erik. The hostages' responses to reporters' questions added to the enigma surrounding their involvement and mindset during this hostage crisis. Friday's most extensive interview, which was not intended for public consumption, was initiated by one of the hostages, Kristen, who phoned the Prime Minister sometime around 5 o'clock in the evening. Unbeknownst to them, their conversation was recorded by the police. I feel like this was obvious, but they didn't know. And this came to light later with police transcripts identifying the mindset of the hostages. During this call, which lasted for 42 minutes, their perspectives diverged widely. Kristen, on one hand, expressed self-preservation concerns, while the Prime Minister upheld the abstract ideal of social stability. Kristen voiced her disappointment with the ongoing situation and accused the Prime Minister of playing games with their lives. She stated that she trusted Clark and Jan-Erik, and she expressed concern that the police would be the ones to provoke violence. The Prime Minister reassured her, but Kristen clearly stated that she wanted to leave with her captors and believed they would be safe as long as the police didn't chase them. Kristen clearly stated that she trusted Clark and Jan-Erik, and she didn't trust the police. Kristen told the Prime Minister that she feared that police would harm her captors, and she implored that the Prime Minister understood her perspective and emphasized her fear of the police, but not the robbers. To Kristen, she saw the robbers as their protector against police aggression. The Prime Minister reasoned that the police wouldn't harm any of the hostages, but Kristen's distrust persisted. She appealed to the Prime Minister's empathy and asked him to imagine himself in her situation. The conversation ended with Kristen sarcastically thanking him for his help. In another phone call, Elizabeth, one of the other hostages, reassured her mother that things weren't as dire as the media and police were portraying. Brigitte, another hostage, had a conversation with her mother, expressing concern for her children, and then she proceeded to receive comfort from Jan-Erik. Sven, the fourth hostage, stated that he felt gratitude towards Jan-Erik after he spared Sven from a planned gunshot. The gratitude was recognized by psychologists as a form of identification with the aggressor. As the days continued to pass, the police intensified their plans to end the ongoing situation. They devised a plan involving tear gas to incapacitate the captives and force Jan-Erik and Clark's surrender. Inside the vault, the hostages endured a sense of isolation and fear. Police placed microphones into the bank vault, which broadcasted crackling static, amplifying their sense of confinement. The constant noise, uncertainty of what was to come, and fluctuating dynamics created an atmosphere of tension, fear, mixed along with unity among the hostages and their captors. The captives were grappling with their own fears and trying to decipher the intentions of Jan-Erik and Clark, as well as the police, all while praying that this would come to an end and they would have some kind of resolution. The atmosphere was switching on and off like a light switch between fear and an odd form of camaraderie. Jan-Erik's concerns about gas seepage prompted him to begin to stuff the vent holes with newspaper. But Jan-Erik also attended to the hostages' needs while harboring, at the same time, severe homicidal thoughts. In spite of this, Jan-Erik's twisted acts of kindness made him endearing to the hostages and shaped him as kind of an emergency god. The group's interactions began to take on a community-like aspect, especially when Jan-Erik shared 3 saved pairs with the group. As time passed, Jan-Erik's radio provided a connection to the outside world. The hostages would listen with their captors for news about their situation and found comfort in the knowledge that they were not forgotten. Jan-Erik's sporadic dancing to music and sharing of personal stories began to humanize him among the group, and the group formed a bond due to their shared experience. However, in spite of this, their personal struggles and differences remained. But Clark's tenderness brought some additional comfort to the group. and the group as a whole found ways to manage basic needs within the vault. It wasn't long before the police's drilling operations signaled a new phase within the ordeal. Jan-Erik planted an explosive charge to show resistance, and even though the hostages felt unsafe, his actions displayed his determination to them somehow. Amidst it all, sleep became a fleeting luxury, something that they just didn't get anymore. The hostages struggled to find solace in their dreams, and even in the few moments that they were able to sleep and dream, the drills intruded. Time continued, and eventually Jan-Erik's resolve wavered, and the police prepared to launch their gas attack. The hostages, who were worn down by fear and tension, faced so many sleepless hours and struggled to breathe as the drilling persisted. The police had already given in to 99% of Jan-Erik's demands. They delivered Clark, the getaway car, the ransom money, but authorities drew the line at allowing Clark and Jan-Erik to escape with the 4 hostages. In spite of the warning that Jan-Erik issued to police that he would murder the hostages if any gas attack was attempted, the police said fuck it, and they pumped tear gas into the vault on August 28th after over 130 hours of captivity. After an hour, Jan-Erik and Clark surrendered, but as the duo were apprehended, the hostages continued to show loyalty to their captors and continued to defend them. This marked the end of the dramatic standoff, but the Norrmalmstorg Syndrome would leave a lasting mark on psychology and criminology. Despite the ordeal, the hostages maintained a bond with their captors, visiting them in prison and expressing concern for their welfare. Psychologists would later call this phenomenon the Norrmalmstorg Syndrome, which later became known as Stockholm Syndrome. Stockholm Syndrome, invented by Swedish criminologist and psychiatrist Nils Bejerot, is a complex psychological response that arises from power imbalances found in situations like hostage-taking, kidnapping, and abusive relationships. However, due to the specific circumstances required for Stockholm Syndrome to occur, it is challenging to conduct valid studies that have a sufficient sample size. As a result, the legitimacy of the condition is disputed to this day. Side note, I'm a really big superhero fan. I promise this is going to make sense. Just buckle up. I am partial to Marvel, although they are just going completely fucking off the rails. Way too many movies. If Stan Lee was still around, this wouldn't happen, but I digress. I also happen to like DC. Big Batman fan. Both Tim Burton and Chris Nolan. Definitely not anything with Ben Affleck. One of the biggest villains, probably the biggest villains in Batman, is obviously the Joker, and he had a weird thing with Harley Quinn. I am so fucking sick of people that don't know shit about fuck. They're like, oh my god, let's have a relationship like the Joker and Harley Quinn. It's so cute. And then you've got the stupid fucking Joker and Harley Quinn couples costumes at Spirit Halloween, which is like my sanctuary, but what the fuck? This is literally an example of Stockholm Syndrome. In fact, I think it's referenced in one of the comics. And I think it was in the animated series that she was a battered girlfriend. She suffered from multiple personalities and had something that was very much like Stockholm Syndrome. Harley Quinn was not always Harley Quinn. She was a psychiatrist that was interviewing the Joker in Arkham Asylum. Shit went down. She got wrapped up in it. Now she's a crazy bitch that swings a mallet around instead of being a famous and intelligent psychiatrist. This long-winded rant is my feeble attempt to tie Stockholm Syndrome into popular culture. Ta-da! Circling back to the fact that it was difficult to study, as a result of this, the legitimacy is disputed to this day. It's not included in the DSM due to the lack of consistent academic research, but according to FBI data, around 8% of hostage victims show clear-cut evidence of Stockholm Syndrome. Stockholm Syndrome has 4 key components that characterize it. They include positive feelings toward the captor, no previous relationship with the captor, refusal to cooperate with authorities, and perceiving the captor as non-threatening while sharing similar values. The 4 bank employees held hostage by Jan-Erik and Clark found themselves in a very terrifying situation, but in spite of this, as the days passed, they began to experience a confusing mix of fear and sympathy eventually forming a bond with their captors. Throughout the ordeal, the hostages were treated with unexpected kindness by Jan-Erik, who comforted them and even allowed them some freedoms. And it were these actions that fostered a bond between the hostages and the captors that would later form the foundations of Stockholm Syndrome. Following the rescue of the hostages and the apprehension of Jan-Erik Olsson as well as Craig Olofsson, Jan-Erik Olsson was sentenced to 10 years in prison. While he was in prison, he received many admiring letters from jailbirds who found him attractive. I will never understand this kink. I'm not trying to kink shame anybody, but can you do a little bit better than a violent person that's in jail? For fuck's sake. Jan-Erik later became engaged to a woman who was not, in spite of what many people stated, one of the former hostages. After his release, he is alleged to have committed further crimes, but after having been on the run from Swedish authorities for 10 years for alleged financial crimes, he turned himself in to police in 2006, only to be told that the charges were no longer being actively pursued. Clark Olofsson was also convicted, but he remained adamant that he had not helped Jan-Erik. Instead, he insisted that he had only tried to save the hostages by keeping the situation calm. Clark was later acquitted in the Svea Court of Appeal and was only required to serve the remaining time in his sentence that he was serving when the police removed him from jail to bring him to the bank. Jan-Erik went on to meet Kristen and Mark, one of the hostages, several times, and their families became friends. In 1996, Jan-Erik moved to northeastern Thailand with his wife and son, but the family returned to Sweden in 2013. Jan-Erik's autobiography, Stockholm Syndrome, was published in Sweden in 2009. The legacy of the Norrmalmstorg Robbery extends beyond the birth of Stockholm Syndrome. The event led to significant police reform and initiated a vigorous debate about the role of media in society. The concept of Stockholm Syndrome started from a bank in Sweden and spread into the realms of psychology, crisis negotiation, and popular culture, including my psychotic rant about the Joker and Harley Quinn. The events of the robbery continue to resonate, and it reminds us of the complexities of the human psyche and the blurred lines between fear and sympathy, captor and captive, criminal and victim. If you or someone you know is experiencing any form of abuse or captivity, please seek help from a trusted authority or contact a helpline dedicated to assisting individuals in crisis. If you liked what you heard today, please review, subscribe. Honestly, the 1-star reviews send me into a downward spiral, but if that's how you feel, so be it. I'm not going to force you either way. Find me on social media, literally everywhere at fthatpod, Instagram at fthat_pod. There is a YouTube channel at fthatpod and Patreon at fthatpod.